It started as a simple plan. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the routine, the phone, the screens, the endless pressure that kept building in my head. I had been working nonstop for months, and my sleep had been bad. I felt tired all the time, and no matter how much coffee I drank or how much I tried to stay focused, I felt like I was falling apart inside. So I took a week off and decided to spend a few days hiking. I picked a place I had never been to before. It was a large forested area in northern Idaho, lots of trail networks, rivers, cliffs, valleys, and miles of backcountry terrain. I had read online that it wasn't too crowded this time of year. That was part of the reason I chose it. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted peace, quiet, to clear my head and walk until I could sleep again. I parked my car near a ranger station, signed the trail register, and headed out. My backpack was full but manageable: tent, sleeping bag, clothes, small stove, freeze-dried meals, water filter, first aid kit, and all the basics. I had hiked solo before, but this would be my longest solo trip. 4 full days and nights on foot, alone. The first day went fine. The trail was dry, the weather was perfect, and I made good progress. The forest was deep and green, and I could hear nothing but the wind and the birds. I followed a well-marked trail for about 10 miles before setting up camp near a stream. I boiled some water, made a quick meal, and slept better than I had in weeks. The second day, I pushed deeper into the backcountry. My plan was to take a longer loop trail that circled around a high ridge and came back down through a narrow canyon. The loop was marked on my map, and I had even downloaded the GPS tracks to my phone, though I preferred using the paper map most of the time. It was late in the afternoon when I reached a junction. According to the map, the left trail would lead me up toward the ridge, while the right would eventually reconnect with the main trail but cut through a valley. I had planned to take the left, but the signpost at the junction was old, crooked, and hard to read. I checked my map again, looked at the terrain, and then made what I thought was the right decision. I took the left fork. That was the mistake. It looked like a trail at first, narrow but walkable. I followed it for another half mile or so before realizing that it wasn't part of the main trail system anymore. It got narrower, rockier, and then began to fade in places. I stopped and took out my map and GPS again. The trail I was on didn't show up clearly. It was either an old path that had been decommissioned, or I had taken a completely different direction than I thought. I didn't panic. I had plenty of supplies and I knew how to backtrack. I decided to keep going a little farther, just to see if the trail would connect to the ridge. Didn't. It got steeper, rougher, and harder to follow. Trees closed in, the light dimmed, and my legs started to ache. Eventually, I reached a small clearing that had some old fire ring stones scattered about. Maybe someone had camped here years ago. I was too tired to turn back at that point, so I decided to set up camp. That night, the wind picked up. The trees creaked above me, and something kept scratching outside my tent. Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon, but it kept me awake longer than I liked. Around 2 a.m., I finally fell asleep. When I woke up, it was colder. The sky looked gray, and I knew the weather was shifting. I boiled some coffee, ate a bar, and repacked. I wanted to find my way back to the main trail before it started raining. I tried to follow the path I came from, but something didn't feel right. I thought I had a good sense of direction, but after walking for over an hour, I didn't recognize anything. The trail had faded. Everything looked the same: trees, rocks, moss, and mud. I checked my GPS, but I had no signal anymore. The map didn't help much either because I wasn't sure where I was on it anymore. That's when I knew I was lost. I stopped, took off my pack, and sat on a flat rock. I tried to calm myself down. I still had food. I still had water. I wasn't hurt, but I also had no idea where the trail was, and the sky was getting darker. I knew I needed to either find higher ground or a water source that would eventually lead me out. I decided to head uphill. It wasn't easy. The slope was steep and filled with loose dirt and roots. I slipped more than once. My knees were starting to hurt. I kept looking back, wondering if I should mark my path with something, but everything looked the same already. After a couple hours of climbing, I reached a rocky outcrop. I could see above the trees for a while. All around me were hills, valleys, and trees, No signs of people, roads, or clearings, just endless forest. I took out my compass and tried to guess which direction I had come from, but I wasn't sure anymore. I decided to keep heading west. According to my map, that direction would eventually lead me to a small river. If I could find the river, I could follow it downstream until I reached the trail again or a road. I started walking again. The terrain got worse. Thick underbrush, fallen trees, and uneven ground made it slow and painful. At one point, I tried to step over a log and twisted my ankle. I fell hard and let out a sharp breath. The pain was immediate, and I thought I had broken something. I sat there for a long time, feeling my ankle throb. It was swelling already. I took off my boot and wrapped it tightly with some cloth from my first aid kit. I tested it slowly, painful, but I could still walk on it if I was careful. The rest of the day was a blur of slow, limping steps, branches scratching my arms, and frustration building in my chest. Around dusk, I found a flat spot near a boulder and set up my tent again. My hands were shaking. I hadn't eaten much. I felt cold even though I had layers on. The wind had picked up again, and it smelled like rain. That night was worse than the one before. I kept hearing sounds, snapping branches, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. My body was sore, my ankle was burning, and I couldn't sleep. I stared at the roof of the tent for hours, waiting for the morning. The rain started just before dawn. It was light at first, but by the time I packed up and started walking, it had turned into a steady downpour. Everything became wet and slippery. My shoes squished with every step. My pack got heavier. I slipped several times and my ankle felt worse. I finally reached a stream in the afternoon. It wasn't the river I had been hoping for, but it was flowing west. That was something. I decided to follow it. Walking along the stream was hard. The banks were steep in places, and the rocks were slick. I slipped into the water once and soaked my entire side. My fingers were numb, and my legs were shaking from fatigue. I thought about stopping, but I didn't want to sleep in the rain again. Around evening, I found a dry spot under a rock overhang. It wasn't much, but it was something. I huddled there, ate a few bites of food, and tried to keep warm. My sleeping bag was damp, and my clothes stuck to my skin. That night, I barely slept at all. The next day, the rain let up a little, but the damage was done. My ankle had swollen more, and now every step sent sharp pain up my leg. I was exhausted, soaked, and completely off trail. I hadn't seen a single person or structure in 2 days. The forest felt like it was closing in. I kept going. Each hour blurred into the next. Walk, stumble, rest. I ran out of clean water and had to use my filter to drink straight from the stream. I rationed my food and started getting lightheaded. My legs gave out a few times. I scraped my palms on rocks and tree bark. I stopped looking at the map because it didn't help anymore. Sometime in the afternoon, I saw something through the trees. It was an old fence, broken, leaning, and half covered in vines, but it was man-made. That gave me hope. I followed it. After maybe an hour, I found what was left of an old cabin. The roof had caved in, and the walls were rotting, but I saw rusted tools and some broken furniture inside. Someone had lived here once. I collapsed next to the wall, too tired to move. I didn't care about the bugs or the dirt. I just laid there and let the rain drip onto my face. When I woke up, the rain had stopped. I got up slowly and started moving again. My body hurt in every way, and my ankle barely held weight, but I knew I had to keep going. If there had been a cabin here once, maybe there was a road nearby. I forced myself to walk. Hours passed. I kept following what looked like a faint path, barely visible, but it felt different than the forest. Maybe it had once been a road. I walked until the sun was almost down, and then I heard it, a distant humming, low, steady, mechanical. I pushed through the trees, dragging my feet, heart pounding. And then I saw it, a narrow gravel road. Not a highway, not paved, but it was real. I stumbled out of the trees and dropped to my knees on the edge of it. About 30 minutes later, a truck came down the road. The driver stopped when he saw me. I must have looked like a ghost. Muddy, wet, scratched, with a swollen ankle and sunken eyes. He gave me water. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. It wasn't because I didn't have people to go with, but more because of the silence. I liked the way my thoughts sounded clearer when I was deep in the forest, away from all the usual distractions. It helped me think, it helped me feel grounded, and for someone who worked behind a desk all week, it made me feel like I was still connected to something real. It was early October. I had taken 3 days off work just to escape into the woods before the weather turned cold. I didn't have a particular trail in mind that time. I wanted to try something new. So after searching around for places I hadn't been, I found a lesser-known trail system called Pine Loop Trails, somewhere near a small town I'd never heard of. It looked remote, surrounded by dense forest and with limited phone signal coverage. That appealed to me. The hike was supposed to be about 13 miles round trip. It looped through thick forest, cut across a ridge, and then wound down alongside a shallow stream before swinging back toward the trailhead. The maps online weren't that detailed, but the elevation looked manageable. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, food for 2 days, and a portable filter for stream water. I had done longer hikes with more gear before, so this felt like a short weekend stretch. I left my car in a tiny gravel parking area near the trail entrance early Friday morning. There were no other cars. The trailhead was marked by a wooden sign that was barely hanging on its hinges. It looked worn and sun-bleached. That should have been my first red flag, but I brushed it off. Some of the best trails I'd hiked had signs like that. Signs no one bothered to maintain because so few people came through. The first few hours were peaceful. I moved steadily along the main trail. The forest was a mix of pine and oak, and the path was narrow but visible, with soft pine needles underfoot. Everything smelled like damp earth and sap. I heard birds, the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, and the breeze moving slowly through the trees. By noon, I stopped for a break and ate a sandwich on a fallen log near a small clearing. I checked my map and decided to continue toward the ridge. That part of the trail was supposed to offer a decent view. I was looking forward to camping on higher ground. It was after that when things started to feel off. The trail started to fade. It didn't disappear completely, but it got harder to follow. Pine needles covered most of it, and fallen branches forced me to climb over or detour around them. The terrain became rockier and uneven. I had to slow down a lot. Every so often I'd come across an old trail marker, usually a red piece of cloth tied to a branch, but they were spread too far apart. Still, I kept going. I've been on plenty of trails like that, and I didn't want to turn back just because it was a little overgrown. I kept checking my compass and my map. I was going in the right direction. I told myself I'd stop at the ridge and make camp there. By late afternoon, I reached it. The ground leveled out, and I came to a wide, open area on top of a ridge overlooking the trees. The sky was starting to dim. I set up my tent near a cluster of rocks, just under a group of pines. I boiled some water, made a simple meal, and sat quietly, watching the light fade. There were no sounds except the wind and the distant creaking of trees. It got cold fast that night. I bundled up inside my sleeping bag, zipped the tent closed, and tried to fall asleep. I woke up once around midnight. I thought I heard something outside, like a stick snapping, but it could have been the cold playing tricks on my ears. I stayed still, heart pounding, holding my breath for a long time. Nothing followed. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning was cloudy. I made some coffee with my small camping stove, packed up, and planned to continue the loop down toward the stream. From there, I'd follow it back toward the main trail and circle back to the car. That was the plan. But I never found the stream. The trail downward was even harder to follow than the one going up. After a while, I realized I hadn't seen a marker in over an hour. I stopped. I checked the map, then the compass. I was going southeast, which should have brought me to the stream eventually, but I saw no water, no changes in terrain, just more forest. And everything started looking the same. I tried backtracking, but nothing looked familiar anymore. I had followed what looked like a trail, but now it just blended into the forest floor. I started to panic a little, but I forced myself to calm down. I told myself I had supplies. I wasn't hurt. I had enough food and water. I could figure it out. I picked a direction that seemed downhill and started walking. I thought if I kept moving down, I'd reach water or maybe a service road. The woods were getting denser now, and the trees were packed closer together. I could hear more creaking, more snapping of branches above me. The clouds overhead were getting darker, and it felt like rain was coming. After another hour of walking, I slipped on wet leaves and fell hard onto my side. My leg twisted under me. I didn't break anything, but I scraped my arm on a rock, and it bled. I wrapped it quickly with gauze from my kit. The worst part wasn't the fall. It was realizing I had no idea where I was anymore. I had completely lost the trail. I checked my phone. 1 bar. I tried to load the map, but it wouldn't refresh. I sent a location ping to a friend, just in case. I didn't even know if it sent. After that, the signal disappeared again. I kept walking, slower now. I was tired. The ground was slick. I started seeing things I thought I'd seen before. Logs I could have sworn I passed. Broken trees that looked familiar. At one point, I found a blackened fire ring. An old one, filled with ash and surrounded by stones. Someone had camped there before, maybe a long time ago. That gave me some hope. I started shouting, even though I knew no one would hear me. The forest swallowed the sound. I kept walking. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I didn't have the energy. I wrapped myself in the sleeping bag under a tree and tried to sleep. I woke up dozens of times. Sometimes to small noises, sometimes just to silence. I kept thinking about animals. I'd seen bear signs earlier in the hike, claw marks on bark, scat near some rocks, but I hadn't seen any actual animals. Still, the thought of being out there alone, injured, off-trail, with food in my pack, it was enough to keep me from sleeping more than a few minutes at a time. By the 3rd day, my food was almost gone. I still had the water filter, and I drank from a muddy puddle I found, just to stay hydrated. Tasted like dirt, but it was something. My injured arm was swollen. I kept walking. I tried marking trees with my knife to avoid walking in circles. I counted steps. I followed anything that looked like a game trail or a footpath, but nothing led anywhere. I started seeing signs of people again, old ones. A crushed aluminum can, almost buried in moss. A piece of blue rope tied to a stump. Once I even saw the rusted frame of a bicycle, half covered in vines. These weren't recent. Whatever trail used to be here hadn't been used in years. That's when the fear really started to set in. Not panic, real fear. Fear that I might not get out, that I might keep walking in circles until I collapsed, that no one would find me because no one came here anymore. The trail was abandoned. The signs were old. No one was going to just stumble upon me. I stopped yelling. I saved my voice. I rationed what little I had left. I slept whenever I couldn't keep my eyes open. Time stopped feeling real. I thought it was still Sunday, but it could have been Monday or Tuesday by then. I lost track of how many days passed. My phone died. My flashlight ran out. I stopped using the compass. It didn't help anymore. Everything around me was just green and brown and gray. No roads, no people, just forest. Then finally, I heard something. It was faint, distant, a low humming. I followed it, stumbling through the trees. It grew louder, a dull rumble. Then I saw a glimpse of silver through the branches. A guardrail. A real road. I ran the last few feet, burst through the trees, and almost collapsed on the asphalt. It was an old service road, barely used. I sat there for almost an hour before a truck passed by. The driver pulled over and called for help. I was taken to a hospital 2 towns over. I was dehydrated, my arm was infected, and I had lost almost 12 pounds in what turned out to be 6 days. 6 days lost in the forest. They told me Pine Loop trails had been closed down years ago after a bad flood wiped out most of the paths. The signs were never taken down. The maps online were outdated. No one had maintained it in years. It was just left to rot and grow wild. No one came looking because I never told anyone exactly where I was going. That was my mistake. I always thought I was prepared, that I could handle anything alone. I still hike, but I don't go off the grid anymore. I tell someone exactly where I'm headed. I carry a personal beacon now, and I stay far away from trails that look forgotten. because I know what it's like to disappear into the woods and not know if you'll ever come back. And I know how lucky I was to come back at all. I was looking for something different that weekend. I had taken time off work for the first time in months, and I didn't want to spend it just sitting around. I wanted to be alone for a while, away from the noise, away from my phone, and away from people. I had been under a lot of stress. Long hours, tight deadlines, coworkers constantly needing things, and I was beginning to feel like I was just running on autopilot. My mind needed to breathe, and the only thing that ever really helped me was being outside. I chose a trail I hadn't hiked before. It was in a national forest about 5 hours from where I lived. The online reviews said it was beautiful but lightly trafficked. That was perfect. It was a loop trail, about 24 miles total, with campsites along the way for overnight hikers. Some people did it in 2 nights, but I was confident I could finish it in 1 if I left early and kept a good pace. I packed light. Just my backpack, sleeping bag, 1-man tent, a water filter, some dehydrated meals, a small stove, 2 bottles of water, my GPS watch, an emergency whistle, a small first aid kit, and my phone. I brought a paper map of the trail too, just in case. I always try to be prepared, but I also like to challenge myself. I didn't want luxury. I wanted the discomfort, the silence, the solitude. I wanted to be tired at the end of the day, to feel like I had worked for something. I drove out the night before and slept in my car near the trailhead. It was cold, and I didn't sleep well. Still, I was up before dawn, and I started walking as the sun came up. The first part of the trail was peaceful, winding through pine trees, up a slow incline. The air was cool and clean, and the forest felt untouched. I didn't see a single person the first 3 hours. The only sounds were my own footsteps, the wind through the trees, and the occasional bird. Felt good. I remember thinking that I needed to do this more often. By mid-morning, I reached the ridgeline. That's when the trail got harder. It narrowed, became rocky, and dropped off steeply on one side. There were no guardrails or signs, just a small dirt path hugging the edge of the ridge. I slowed down and watched my footing. One wrong step and you'd tumble a long way down into the woods below. I kept walking. I passed a section where the trail had partially crumbled from erosion. I had to hug the rock wall and inch across carefully. After that, the trail dipped down into thick forest again. The sunlight became patchy, and it got colder in the shade. I checked my GPS watch and I was making good time. Around noon, I stopped to eat. I found a flat rock beside the trail and pulled out a bag of trail mix and a protein bar. I sat there for 20 minutes, enjoying the quiet. Then I got up and kept going. I remember thinking the trail was much tougher than I expected, but I felt good. I wasn't tired yet. The next few miles were downhill. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no trash, no noise, just woods all around. Then I saw something that didn't sit right. A torn-up backpack lying a few feet off the trail, near a cluster of bushes. It was old and dirty, the fabric faded and frayed. At first, I thought someone had dumped trash, but when I looked closer, I saw that it had been there a long time. Plants had started growing around it. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a minute. It could have belonged to a hiker who left it, or maybe someone got injured and was rescued. Still, something about it felt off. I took a photo of it on my phone, just in case. Then I kept going. I told myself not to worry, but as I walked, I started feeling different. The woods felt heavier, darker. The trees were thicker now, packed close together. The trail curved and narrowed again. It wasn't scary exactly, just isolating, the kind of quiet that presses down on you. I started noticing things, broken branches, scrapes on tree trunks, a glove hanging from a branch, stiff and weather-worn. That's when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour. I checked my GPS and the signal was weak, but it showed I was still on the trail. I kept moving, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to backtrack yet. I figured I'd see a sign soon. The forest got even denser. The trail became hard to follow in places, covered in dead leaves and fallen branches. I had to move slower. At one point, I lost the trail completely and had to circle around for 15 minutes until I spotted a faint path again. It shook me a bit, but I was still sure I'd make it out by sundown. Then I heard something. It was distant, but sharp, like a short snapping sound. I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like something moving fast through brush. I stood there, frozen, waiting. Then silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer or something small, maybe a rabbit. I kept walking a little faster now. About half an hour later, I reached a part of the trail that looked different. The trees opened up a bit, and the sun was finally getting through. I started to relax. Then I saw a second backpack. This one was newer, red, and sitting against a tree like someone had set it down. But there was no one around. I waited for a while, looking around, listening. Nothing. I didn't want to go near it, but I had to. I walked over slowly. The pack looked clean. A water bottle sat next to it, still half full. I didn't touch it. I took a photo again and checked my GPS. The signal was gone. I stood there a long time trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back, but I wasn't even sure which way I came from at that point. I kept going forward, telling myself that the loop had to come back around soon. I'd just follow the path. That was the only option. But the trail kept getting worse. It narrowed again, the trees closed in, and the ground became uneven. Roots stuck out everywhere. Then I slipped. I stepped on a wet patch of leaves and went down hard. My left knee slammed into a rock, and I let out a grunt. Pain shot through my leg, and I rolled onto my back, breathing heavy. Took a few minutes before I could sit up. My knee throbbed, but it wasn't broken, just bruised. I tested it and I could still walk, but every step hurt now. I slowed down a lot after that. I kept checking my GPS, hoping the signal would come back. Didn't. The battery was starting to run low. I tried my phone. No signal either. I was really out there. The sun started dropping, and I realized I wasn't going to finish the trail before dark. I needed to find a place to camp. I hadn't wanted to spend the night out there, but I had no choice. I found a flat patch of ground near a boulder and set up my tent. I boiled some water, made one of the meals I brought, and tried to rest. But I couldn't sleep. All night I kept hearing things. Small cracking noises in the distance. Once, I heard something big move through the brush not far from my tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, holding my knife, heart pounding. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I packed up and kept moving. My knee was stiff and sore, but I pushed through it. I wanted to get out of those woods. Hours passed, and the trail became almost invisible. I had to rely on landmarks and my sense of direction. Then I noticed the smell. Something rotten, faint at first, but getting stronger. I followed it without meaning to, hoping it might lead to a road or something man-made. That's when I found the shoe. It was lying in the dirt. A single hiking boot, muddy and old. A few feet away, a tattered shirt was caught on a branch. I froze. Something was wrong here. It wasn't just one hiker who'd been out here and left stuff behind. There were signs of people everywhere, but no actual people. And no rescue tape, no ranger notes, nothing official. Just personal items, left behind. I started to panic a little. I forced myself to breathe and move faster. I needed out. The woods became unfamiliar. I was sure I was off the trail now. My GPS watch finally died. I tried to use the sun to keep my direction straight, but the canopy above made it hard. Then I saw the cabin. It was small and worn down, sitting in a clearing. The windows were boarded, and the wood was gray from age. There were no signs of life. I didn't want to go near it, but I needed help, water, anything. I circled it slowly. There was no sound, no animals, no birds. I didn't go in. I didn't even try the door. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been abandoned for a reason. I kept walking, faster now, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't feel alone anymore. The woods were too quiet. By the afternoon, I was exhausted, limping, and almost out of water. I stopped caring about direction. I just kept moving downhill, hoping it would lead to a road. And finally, it did. I came out onto a gravel Forest Service road. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I followed it for over an hour before I saw a truck coming toward me. I waved it down and the driver, an older guy, stared at me like I was a ghost. He asked if I was okay. I nodded. He gave me water and drove me down to the ranger station. The rangers took a report. They said that I had always liked solo hiking. I know it isn't the smartest thing to do, but being out there alone helped clear my mind in a way nothing else could. There's something about walking through the quiet woods with no noise but the birds, the wind in the trees, and my own footsteps that makes me feel calm. It had become a regular thing for me. Once a month, I'd pick a new trail, pack my gear, and disappear into the mountains for 2 or 3 days. I never went too far off the grid, and I always left a detailed itinerary with someone. I knew the risks. This trip was supposed to be like the others. A 2-day hike along a remote trail in Montana that I found online. It was steep and less traveled, but the views were supposed to be incredible and I was craving the isolation. I started early on a Friday morning. The air was cold and clean, and the sky was pale blue with a few thin clouds stretching across it. I parked my car at the trailhead, locked everything up, strapped on my pack, and set off. The first few hours were easy. The trail followed a steady incline through tall pines and thick underbrush. Everything smelled like sap and dirt. I passed a few old trail markers, faded and cracked, but otherwise saw no sign of anyone else. No boot prints, no trash, just trees and rocks and the distant rush of a creek somewhere down below. By mid-afternoon, I had climbed high enough to see the surrounding hills. They rolled on for miles in every direction. That's when I realized just how far from everything I really was. I found a flat area just off the trail and set up my tent there. I boiled some water, ate a quick meal, then walked a bit farther uphill to watch the sunset. The sky turned orange, then purple, and the air got colder fast. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sounds of owls and the wind. The next morning, I woke up stiff but rested. I packed up, ate a quick breakfast, and continued on the trail. That day's hike was tougher. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, with long stretches that were more like animal tracks than anything made for hikers. At times, I had to crouch under branches or climb over fallen logs. Still, I was enjoying it. There was something peaceful about being that far removed from everything. I didn't see a single person the entire day. Around mid-afternoon, I came to a small clearing with a shallow stream running through it. I decided to refill my water there. I crouched by the stream, filtering water into my bottle, when I noticed something odd across the clearing. It looked like a ripped tarp, partially buried under pine needles and leaves. I walked over to check it out. It wasn't a tarp. It was a backpack. A large, heavy-duty hiking backpack, faded and dirty, with one of the straps torn. I looked around, half expecting someone to be nearby, but the forest was quiet. I unzipped one of the compartments. Inside were some clothes, a small camping stove, and a sealed bag of food that looked years old. There was also a notebook, soggy and falling apart. I flipped through it, but most of the pages were smudged with water damage. I could only make out a few scribbled words here and there, something about wrong turns and food running out. I don't know why I didn't just leave it alone. Maybe I felt like I should take it back and report it. I stuffed the notebook into my own bag and left the rest. I was about to turn back to the trail when I noticed something else. Just past the trees, maybe 15 feet away, there was a pile of rocks. Not natural looking. They were stacked, carefully, deliberately, like a marker. I walked over and looked closer. It was about 3 feet tall, made of smooth stones, each one placed precisely. It didn't feel like something hikers would make. I've seen cairns before, and they're usually rough and meant to mark paths. This was more like a memorial. A chill ran through me. I didn't want to touch it. I backed away and returned to the trail, walking faster now. The peaceful feeling was gone. I kept looking over my shoulder. I told myself it was just someone else's bad luck. A hiker who got lost or injured and had to abandon their gear. Maybe they were rescued. Maybe they made it out. But I didn't believe that. That night, I camped in a small hollow between 2 ridges. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up at every sound. branches snapping, something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was deer, maybe a bear, though I'd seen no fresh tracks. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, human footsteps, but when I unzipped the tent and looked out, I saw nothing. The next morning, I felt off. I was tired, and I had that uneasy feeling like when you know something isn't right but you can't explain it. I decided to cut the trip short and take a different trail down the mountain. There was a loop that circled back to the trailhead from the east. It would add a few miles but bring me down faster. The new trail was harder to follow. It was narrower and even less maintained than the main one. At times, it disappeared completely, and I had to navigate using my map and compass. The deeper I went, the more overgrown it became. The trees pressed in closer, the air thicker. I hadn't seen the sun for hours, just clouds and pine needles overhead. I stopped for a break near an old stump and pulled out my water bottle. That's when I smelled it. Something foul, like something rotting. I stood up and looked around but didn't see anything. I didn't want to stay there long. I pushed on. A mile later, I came across what looked like an old animal den. The dirt had been dug out, and something had definitely been living there. But the smell was stronger now. I walked a little closer. There were bones scattered near the entrance. Some small, like from rabbits or squirrels, but others were bigger, much bigger. One looked like it belonged to a deer. Another looked almost human. I didn't stop to look again. I picked up my pace. I didn't care about saving energy anymore. I just wanted to get off the mountain. My legs were shaking, partly from exhaustion, partly from fear. The trail was barely visible, and I had to keep checking my map. At one point, I took a wrong turn and ended up at the edge of a ravine. I had to backtrack almost half a mile. Around late afternoon, I started seeing old signs of logging, stumps, rusted tools, even the frame of a collapsed shack. It meant I was getting closer to civilization. That gave me a bit of hope. I kept going faster now. I reached the trailhead by evening. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time just breathing. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat and stared at the trees, half expecting something to come running out. But nothing did. When I got home, I called the ranger station and told them about the abandoned pack and the rock pile. They took my report but didn't seem too concerned. Said it was probably an old site and they'd look into it. I never heard back. That night, I took the notebook out of my bag and laid it flat on my desk. I flipped through it again, this time more carefully. Most of it was still unreadable, but a few more words had dried enough to make out. One sentence stood out near the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Still watching me, every night. Can't run anymore. I didn't sleep well that night either. I haven't gone hiking alone since then. I still love the woods, the quiet, the peace. But now I always go with someone else. And I never stray from the marked trails. Something happened out there, and I don't think I want to know exactly what. I just know I got lucky. Someone else didn't. I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in late October, just before the real cold of winter started setting in. I had taken time off work for a week, and I wanted to disconnect completely. No phones, no people, just me, my backpack, and the woods. I picked a trail that wasn't too popular but still mapped. It was in a national forest, about 4 hours from where I lived. I had researched it thoroughly. The loop trail was around 38 miles long, stretching through valleys, dense woods, and a few ridgelines. Most people completed it in about 3 to 4 days. I planned on taking 5 so I could enjoy the quiet and take my time. The first day went smoothly. I arrived early in the morning, parked my car at the designated lot, signed in at the trail register, and started the hike. The air was cold but not freezing. It was peaceful. The leaves were mostly golden and red, the kind of colors that make you want to stop every few steps and stare. The trail was well marked, and my pack, though heavy, sat comfortably on my back. I covered about 10 miles that day and camped near a small creek. That night, I slept well with the sound of the water close by. On the second day, things started to feel a bit off. I didn't see another person, which wasn't completely unexpected given the season and the trail's reputation for being quiet. But still, I expected at least one other hiker. The forest felt thicker, darker, like it had closed in a bit. The air was colder than the forecast had predicted, and there was a strong wind in the afternoon. I remember standing on a ridge and feeling like the trees were swaying harder than they should. I pushed on and made it to the next camp area by late afternoon. It was a flat section near a fallen log. I set up my tent, boiled some water, and made a quick dinner. That night, I didn't sleep as well. There was a sound outside the tent that kept waking me up. Not an animal. It sounded like metal tapping rock. It happened several times, and every time I unzipped the tent to check, there was nothing there. On the third day, I planned to make it to a spot known as Split Hollow, which was roughly halfway through the loop. I started early and walked fast. The trail started getting harder. There were more rocks, the terrain steeper, and at one point, the path split without any markings. I used my map and compass and chose the left fork. It was a narrow trail that led through dense brush, but according to the map, it connected back to the main loop. That section was rough. The trail narrowed until it was barely a foot wide. The trees pressed in close, and I started seeing more signs of wildlife, droppings, scratch marks, feathers, but still no people. By late afternoon, I reached what I thought was Split Hollow. It matched the description. A deep bowl in the landscape, surrounded by high ridges on three sides. The wind howled through it. I set up camp near a cluster of trees and made a small fire. As night came, I noticed a strong feeling of being watched. It was just a sensation, but it stayed with me. I ate quickly and climbed into my tent. The tapping sound returned. This time it was louder, more frequent. I stayed still, listening. At one point, it sounded like it was right next to my tent. I held my breath. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 20 feet from my tent, there were two sticks driven into the ground, crossed over each other like an X. At the center was a smooth rock, maybe the size of a baseball, with a deep scratch across it. It didn't look natural. It didn't look like something random. I looked around the area. Nothing else seemed disturbed. I didn't hear anyone during the night, but the placement was too deliberate. I packed up quickly and started hiking. I didn't even eat breakfast. My nerves were shot. The trail out of Split Hollow was steep and slick with leaves. I fell once, slid about 10 feet, and bruised my hip. My leg throbbed, but I kept moving. I just wanted to get out. But around midday, I realized something was wrong. I was going in circles. I passed a large boulder with a split in the center that I had marked on my map. Then, 2 hours later, I passed it again. I hadn't made a full circle, not unless the trail twisted without showing on the map, which didn't make sense. I tried to backtrack. The trees all looked the same, and the sun was mostly hidden behind clouds. I started to panic a bit. I decided to set up camp early, calm down, and look at my map again with a clear head. I found a flat spot near a mossy stump and built a small fire. That night, I didn't even bother with the tent. I wrapped myself in my tarp and sleeping bag and kept the fire going. I didn't want to be inside something. I wanted to see everything around me. The tapping sound came again. This time it was different. There was a dragging sound with it, like something being pulled through the dirt. I sat up and stared into the woods. The fire crackled, but I couldn't see anything beyond the first row of trees. Then I heard a snap, not like a twig, like something heavier. I stayed awake the whole night, watching, listening. Nothing came closer, but I didn't feel safe. By morning, I decided to abandon the loop and bushwhack toward what I thought was the direction of the nearest road. According to my map, there was an old fire service road a few miles east. I used my compass and started pushing through thick brush, cutting across steep ravines and over fallen logs. Every hour or so, I stopped to recheck my direction. The forest was so quiet now. No birds, no wind, just my breathing and the sound of my steps. After 5 or 6 hours, I found what looked like a logging road. It was overgrown, but the shape was there, a straight line cutting through the trees. I followed it. I walked until the light started to fade. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, dark, and looked abandoned. The roof sagged in places and the windows were boarded up. But I was too tired to care. I approached it slowly, made sure the door wasn't locked, and stepped inside. The place smelled like damp wood and old rot. There was a cot in the corner, some empty cans on a shelf, and a small stove. I closed the door and pushed a chair against it. That night, I sat with my back to the wall, listening. The tapping didn't come. The dragging didn't come. It was silent. In the morning, I found a dirt path behind the cabin. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a road or maybe another trail. It did. After about 3 hours, I reached a gravel road. I followed that for another 2 hours before I saw a pickup truck parked off to the side. A man was cutting wood nearby. I waved him down, and he gave me a ride to the nearest ranger station. They told me I had come out almost 20 miles east of the trail loop, deep into an unmarked part of the forest. They said nobody should have been out there. When I described the area, the rangers looked at each other and then told me that part of the forest hadn't been managed in years, and it wasn't even listed on most maps anymore. The cabin I stayed in didn't exist on their records. I gave them the best information I could. They logged it, but nothing came of it. I never found out what the tapping was or who or what put those sticks in the ground. I haven't been hiking alone since. The experience stuck with me, not because of something supernatural, but because of how real it all felt. How easy it was to get lost. How fast the forest can change. And how sometimes the scariest things aren't what you can see. They're what you can't explain, even when you know they're real. I didn't plan to hike that long, not really. It just sort of happened because I wanted to push myself. I'd done short overnight hikes, weekend backpacking trips here and there, mostly in places where I knew I could turn around quickly if something went wrong. But this time, I picked a 5-day loop called the Deadfall Loop in northern Montana. The name wasn't meant to sound creepy. It was named after a creek that ran through a valley filled with deadfall, those fallen trees that lie tangled and gray, half rotting under the pine canopy. I had read about it on some hiking forums, and while it wasn't very well known, a few people said it was remote, beautiful, and intense. That's what I wanted. A challenge, solitude, something to prove to myself that I could do it. I drove up from Missoula in early September, car loaded with everything I thought I'd need: tent, stove, water filters, food for 6 days just in case. I had a detailed topo map, compass, and GPS unit with spare batteries. I told 2 friends where I was going, texted them the loop, and let them know I'd check in once I got back into signal. The trailhead was nearly empty when I got there. Just one other truck parked near the dusty wooden sign. The air smelled like pine sap and dry needles, and the sun was already high by the time I got my boots laced and pack on. The first day was peaceful. Birds chirped in bursts, and the trail wound gently uphill through old forest. I crossed 2 shallow creeks with clear, cold water. I saw deer prints and what I thought were elk tracks in the mud. My legs burned, but I welcomed it. I didn't see anyone all day, which I expected. I made camp near a ridge. I hung my food bag in a tree away from camp, ate a quick meal of tuna and crackers, and crawled into my tent just as the last pink light faded behind the trees. It was cold that night. I curled into my bag, listening to the wind brushing through the branches above, and the occasional snap of something. Maybe a twig, maybe a pine cone falling, but nothing close. I slept well. On the second day, the trail began to climb more steeply. I started early to get ahead of the heat. I followed the trail around a ridge and up into a higher basin where it leveled off for a bit. The views opened up. Long green valleys stretched out below, and jagged gray peaks stabbed the sky ahead. There were no signs of people. No wrappers, no fire pits, no boot prints. It felt wild, untouched. Around midday, I came across a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on the map. One path looked wide and somewhat maintained, with a few recent boot marks in the dirt. The other was narrow and overgrown, with moss covering the ground and dead branches scattered across it. I hesitated, double-checked my GPS, and saw that the narrow trail seemed to match the loop I had planned. So I took it. The air felt different immediately, cooler, damp. The sun disappeared behind thicker trees. I passed through patches of deadfall, big tangled trunks that I had to climb over or crawl under. Some were slick with moss, and I slipped once, banging my shin hard on a branch. It throbbed, and I cursed myself for not being more careful. I didn't make as many miles as I had hoped that day. The trail kept vanishing under piles of branches or soft, spongy ground. Sometimes I wasn't even sure if I was on the trail anymore, but the GPS kept me close enough. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I set up camp next to a flat rock outcrop with a view of the forest below. It was quiet, too quiet maybe. That night I kept waking up, not because of any sound, but because of the lack of it. There were no insects buzzing, no night birds calling, just the wind and my own breathing. At one point I thought I heard a heavy snap from deep in the woods, like something large stepping on a thick branch, but it didn't come closer. I stayed very still in my bag, heart thumping in my chest, until I finally drifted back off. On the third day, things got worse. I woke up to find my food bag on the ground. The cord had snapped or been chewed through. The bag was torn open, and a lot of my food was gone. The wrapper from a pack of tortillas was shredded, and 2 of my protein bar wrappers were licked clean. I thought maybe a bear had gotten to it, but there weren't any huge claw marks or obvious damage, just a lot of saliva and bite holes. Maybe a raccoon or coyote. I counted what I had left. Enough to stretch 4 days if I rationed. Not ideal, but doable. I repacked and moved on. The trail didn't improve. In fact, it got worse. More fallen trees, more confusing sections. At one point, I followed a game trail for nearly half a mile before I realized I had veered way off course. When I turned back, I had to rely entirely on the GPS because everything looked the same. Just trees, dead branches, and soft, uneven ground. By mid-afternoon, a fog started to roll in. It wasn't thick at first, but enough to make the distance look fuzzy. The light took on a strange gray tone, like it was evening already, even though it was barely 3 p.m. I picked up my pace, trying to reach a marked lake on the map where I had planned to camp. But I never found it. What I did find, about an hour before sunset, was a collapsed old hunting cabin. It wasn't on the map and didn't show up on any trip report I had read. It looked abandoned. Roof caved in on one side, moss growing up the walls, no glass in the windows. The door was hanging off the hinges, and there were rusted metal pieces scattered around the yard. Old traps, broken tools, maybe a stove at some point. I didn't want to stay there, but the fog had thickened, and I couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. I was tired, hungry, and a little shaken, so I set up camp about 100 feet away from the cabin, just under a small grove of trees. I didn't want to be inside that thing, but I also didn't want to wander further off the trail. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds from the direction of the cabin. At first, it was soft creaking, probably just the wind moving broken boards. Then something that sounded like metal clinking. Once I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves, slow and crunching, circling my tent. I stayed dead still, clutching my knife, waiting for whatever it was to go away. Eventually, it did. But I didn't sleep after that. The 4th day was a mess. I started moving before sunrise. The fog was still thick. My GPS was glitchy, kept lagging or freezing for long stretches, and I had to stop and restart it multiple times. I couldn't tell which way the trail went anymore, and without clear views, everything looked the same. At one point, I realized I had been walking in a wide circle when I came across the same fallen log with my own boot print near it. That hit me hard. I'd been wasting hours. Panic started to creep in. I forced myself to stop, eat what little I could, and calm down. I took out the compass, tried to get a rough bearing, and decided to push east. According to the map, the trail should eventually drop into a valley and meet up with another marked route. But the forest fought me the whole way. More deadfall, wet moss, slippery rocks. I lost my footing at least twice, and the second time I landed badly, twisting my ankle. It wasn't broken, but it was sore and made every step a grind. I limped on, using my trekking pole for support. I stopped caring about mileage or making camp on time. I just wanted to get out. That evening, I couldn't find a good spot to sleep. The ground was either too sloped, too wet, or covered in old logs. I ended up making camp on a flat patch near a rock face. I barely ate, just a few spoonfuls of peanut butter and a handful of trail mix. I was down to my last scraps. That night, the temperature dropped. My ankle throbbed in the cold, and the wind howled through the trees like a warning. I buried myself in the sleeping bag and tried to ignore the pain. Again, I heard something out in the woods. Not close, but steady. Pacing? Couldn't be sure. I didn't have the energy to care anymore. On the 5th day, I woke up determined. I told myself I would keep heading east until I found the lower trail or a creek or a landmark. Anything that would get me back on track. But the forest didn't make it easy. I climbed a ridge that took hours to summit, only to find nothing but more trees on the other side. No trail, no clearing, no signs of people. The GPS was still acting strange, flickering between positions, sometimes freezing entirely. I gave up on it. I just kept walking. My water ran low. I sucked moisture from wet moss when I could. I refilled from a muddy puddle and filtered it 3 times. Around mid-afternoon, I heard something I hadn't heard in days. A low hum, faint but constant. I pushed toward it and eventually came to a power line clearing. A straight, thin cut through the forest with tall steel poles stretching in both directions. I almost cried. I followed the clearing for miles until I reached a service road. It wasn't on my map, but it was gravel and there were tire tracks. I followed that road for hours, limping, dragging, dehydrated. Eventually, I came to a gate and a dirt lot with a hunting cabin that looked in use, solar panel, firewood stacked neatly, ATV parked outside. No one was there, but the cabin was unlocked. I had been hiking for years before that trip. I always told myself I knew what I was doing. I'd done dozens of solo hikes, some that lasted for days, most in complete isolation. I'd learned how to read maps, how to find clean water, how to stay calm when I got lost. I thought I had it all figured out, but that trip taught me something else. No matter how much you think you know, nature doesn't care. And sometimes the most dangerous parts aren't even the wild animals or the terrain. It's what humans leave behind, in places they don't want anyone to see. It started on a long weekend in mid-September. I'd taken Friday off work and planned to hike into a less traveled region of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. The spot I picked was called Cedar Hollow, and I only picked it because I'd found an old hiking forum post where someone had mentioned it once. No maps really showed trails going through it, and it wasn't listed on any of the official park brochures. That made it more appealing to me. I liked being alone out there. I had loaded my pack with everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, my life straw, an emergency beacon, and my phone with GPS maps downloaded. I had a paper topo map too, just in case. I wasn't new to this. I always planned for things to go wrong. I parked at a trailhead near a small town called Featherton, about 4 hours from Boise. The trail was mostly empty, just an older couple getting ready to head out as I was tightening my boots. I smiled and nodded, but we didn't speak. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. The first day of hiking was easy. The air was cold and clean, and the trees were already starting to turn orange and red. I followed the main trail for about 6 miles before I split off and started bushwhacking north toward where I thought Cedar Hollow would be. My plan was to camp one night about a mile or 2 south of it, then push into the hollow early the next morning. I set up my tent in a small clearing near a dry creek bed. I gathered some dead wood, started a small fire, and cooked one of those foil pouch meals, chili mac, I think. As the sun went down, the sky turned this deep purple color, and everything got real quiet. That kind of silence you only get when you're miles away from any road or people. Just my breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the sound of wind moving through trees. That night I slept deeply. Nothing bothered me. No animal sounds. No branches breaking. Nothing. It was almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The next morning, I woke up at sunrise, packed up quickly, and started moving north towards Cedar Hollow. The terrain was getting steeper with more rocks and thicker underbrush. After about an hour of hiking, I came across an old, faded sign nailed to a tree. It was barely readable. The wood was cracked, and the paint had mostly peeled off. I had to step closer and squint to make it out. It said, "No access beyond this point, U.S. Forest Service." Underneath that, someone had spray painted over it in red, "Turn back." I froze for a second. It wasn't unusual to find old signs like that, especially near old mining areas or protected land. But this one didn't feel like that. It wasn't listed on any of the maps I'd checked. I hadn't seen anything about restricted areas in this section of the forest. I looked around. There were no fences, no cameras, no fresh signs, just that one old board nailed crooked to a pine tree. I stood there for a few minutes, debating whether to keep going or not. I even took out my phone, but there was no signal. The offline map showed that I was already close to the spot marked as Cedar Hollow, maybe another mile at most. I told myself it was just outdated, probably for logging or fire control years ago. Nothing serious, so I kept walking. About half an hour later, the woods started to feel different. It wasn't a specific thing I could point to. The trees were still tall and healthy. The undergrowth was thick but manageable. But the silence had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it felt heavy, like everything had gone still, not just quiet. I couldn't even hear birds anymore. That was the first time I felt real unease. I stopped for water and sat on a downed log to rest. As I drank, I noticed that there were no bugs around. Not a single one. No flies, no bees, not even mosquitoes. I thought maybe it was the elevation, but I'd been higher up in other hikes and still had to swat bugs away. I started moving again, more alert this time, looking for signs of wildlife or anything out of the ordinary. The trees were thicker now, and the light coming through the canopy was dimmer, even though it was still late morning. I could smell damp earth, moss, and something faint I couldn't place, like rusted metal or old oil. Finally, I reached what I thought was the edge of Cedar Hollow. It was a wide, shallow valley surrounded by steep ridges. The trees opened up into a stretch of grass and rock. There was a small stream running through it. I stood at the edge, looking down, and immediately noticed something strange. There were structures down there, not cabins or houses. These were like large, box-shaped containers, maybe 10 or 12 of them, scattered unevenly across the hollow. They looked like old military storage units, gray, rusted, with flat roofs. Some were partially sunk into the earth. Others were covered in moss and vines. I dropped my pack and took out my binoculars. There were no markings on the buildings, no doors I could see, but there were small, dark holes near the bases of some of them, maybe air vents. No movement, no signs of people. It looked completely abandoned. I stood there for a long time, debating whether to go down or not. In the end, I told myself that I'd come this far. I was curious. I could check it out quickly, take a few pictures, and get out. The slope was steep, and I had to use trees to brace myself as I descended. The ground was soft in places and smelled strongly of wet metal and something chemical, like old fuel. When I reached the hollow floor, I felt how cold it was, much colder than it should have been. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees, and I could see my breath. That made no sense. It wasn't even noon yet. I walked up to the nearest structure and touched the metal wall. It was freezing, like it had been refrigerated. I knocked on it lightly, and the echo was strange, hollow but deep, like there was a lot of space inside. I walked around it, looking for an entrance, but there wasn't one. No handles, no hinges, just a smooth, corroded wall all the way around. I moved on to another structure. Same thing. I started getting frustrated. Felt like something wasn't right. These weren't storage containers. They were sealed on purpose, like whatever was inside wasn't supposed to come out or wasn't supposed to be seen. Near the far side of the hollow, I found a half-buried structure with one corner collapsed inward. The metal was bent and torn, exposing a dark gap. It looked like it had caved in from age or maybe a tree falling on it. I crouched down and peered inside. It was pitch black. The smell coming out of the hole was strong, like mold, rust, and something faintly sour. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it into the gap. Inside, there was a room about the size of a small garage. The walls were lined with racks, and there were broken crates scattered across the floor. Most of them were smashed or rotten, but a few still had writing on them, military stenciling. I couldn't read the text fully, but I saw words like BIO and contain. I stood there for a while just staring. My heart was pounding. I had no idea what I was looking at, but it wasn't supposed to be here. It felt like the kind of place you hear about in conspiracy theories, Cold War research sites, or dumping grounds for classified materials. Then I heard something, a soft creaking sound, like metal shifting. I jumped back and turned off the light. The hollow was dead quiet again. I waited, holding my breath, listening for anything else. Nothing, but something had moved. I backed away from the structure and turned to leave. As I climbed out of the hollow, I felt something hit me, a deep sense of urgency, like I needed to get out of there fast. I couldn't explain it, but it felt primal. My legs started moving faster on their own, and I climbed the ridge as quickly as I could, heart racing. When I got to the top and looked back down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were tracks in the grass, fresh ones, leading from the broken structure toward where I had just been. I hadn't made them. They were long, narrow drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled through the grass. That's when I panicked. I grabbed my pack, adjusted the straps, and started heading back the way I came. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to check the map. I just moved. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every snapped twig, every gust of wind made me flinch. I hiked for hours, way past where I had planned to camp that night. By the time I stopped, it was almost dark. I pitched my tent in a small gully between two ridges, hidden from view. I didn't light a fire. I didn't eat. I just crawled into my sleeping bag and laid there, every muscle tight. I didn't sleep much. At one point in the night, I heard movement near my tent. Slow, steady footsteps. I've always been someone who liked quiet places. Crowds make me uneasy, and too much noise gives me headaches. That's why I hike. For years, I've been taking long solo hikes into the woods and mountains. It started as a way to escape the pressure of everyday life, but over time, it turned into a kind of therapy. The silence, the crunch of boots on dirt, the wind in the trees, it all became something I needed. I always took precautions. Maps, GPS, plenty of food and water, a first aid kit, bear spray, a knife, flares, and even a small satellite beacon in case I got lost. I wasn't stupid, just quiet. I never hiked unprepared. Last year, in early September, I took a week off work and drove out to the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho. I'd read about a few lesser-known trails near a place called Bear Ridge. It wasn't exactly remote, but it wasn't one of the popular trails either. The elevation climbed fast, and the path dropped into valleys and steep switchbacks that turned a lot of casual hikers away. That was fine with me. I was looking for something with a little challenge. I parked my truck near a faded wooden sign where the trail started. The path wound through pine and spruce trees, their scent thick in the air. It was early morning, a bit chilly, but the sun was just starting to rise over the hills. I had my 45-liter pack on, loaded with everything I needed for 4 days of hiking. My goal was to loop around Bear Ridge, cut through a narrow pass, and descend into a wide forested valley I'd seen on satellite images. After that, I'd return by taking a parallel trail that ran lower and followed a river all the way back to where I started. The first day went fine. The climb was hard, but steady. The air was cool and dry, perfect weather. I saw elk tracks, a few deer, and even a fox. There weren't any other hikers, just me and the woods. That night, I set up camp on a flat ridge with a wide view of the valley below. I boiled some noodles on my small stove and ate in silence, staring out at the deep greens and browns stretching for miles. Before sunset, I walked a bit around the area, checking for signs of bears or mountain lions, but I didn't see much. I made sure to store my food away from the tent, hung up high in a tree. I fell asleep with the wind rustling through the branches above me. The next morning, I woke early and broke camp. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and started hiking before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. The trail dipped into a shady forest. The light was dim even by mid-morning because of the thick tree cover. Around noon, I reached the pass. It was narrow, rocky, and a little unstable, but it was nothing I hadn't handled before. I took it slow, On the far side, the land dropped fast into a ravine I had to cross to reach the next leg of the trail. The map I had was old, but it showed a bridge, just a thin wooden crossing over the narrowest part of the ravine. When I got there, I saw the bridge, or what was left of it. The boards were broken and scattered, and only a few pieces of the frame still hung in place. It must have collapsed years ago. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. The drop wasn't huge, maybe 30 feet, but the rocks below looked sharp and wet. There was no way I could cross here. I pulled out my GPS and checked for another way across. The device showed the slope continuing down toward the bottom of the ravine, then back up the other side. No trail, but the slope looked manageable. It would take longer, maybe a few extra hours, but I didn't want to backtrack. I still had 2.5 days of supplies, and the valley ahead looked promising. I figured I could hike down into the ravine, cross the stream at the bottom, and climb up the far side. The descent was harder than I expected. The soil was loose, and the slope steeper than it looked from above. I kept slipping, using tree roots to steady myself. At one point I twisted my ankle a bit, but after walking it off for a few minutes, it felt all right. I made it to the bottom in about an hour and crossed a cold, fast-moving stream. The rocks were slick, and I had to take off my boots to wade through. The water was icy and numbed my feet. On the far side, I took a short break, ate some trail mix, and let my feet dry before putting my boots back on. The climb up was much tougher. The slope was full of thick underbrush, and I had to push my way through thorny bushes that scraped my arms. There was no trail, just a general direction. It got worse when I hit a small rockslide area. The loose stones gave way beneath me. I slipped and fell a few feet, cutting my forearm on a sharp edge. Blood ran down my hand and dripped off my fingers, but I washed it with clean water and wrapped it in gauze from my kit. I kept climbing, slower now. The sun was already past its highest point, and I started worrying about how much daylight I had left. The trees thinned near the top, and I finally pulled myself up onto level ground. I stood there, breathing hard, looking at the forest ahead. My arms and legs were scratched, and my clothes were damp with sweat. But I was back on the route. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The trail ahead was nearly invisible. I checked my GPS again, and it told me I was close to where the trail should be, but I didn't see it. I wandered a bit, looking for markers or cleared ground. After maybe 20 minutes, I found something that looked like the path, just a faint track through the trees. I followed it. The ground was soft, and my boots sank into it slightly as I walked. The trees were thicker now, and the light seemed darker than it should have been for the time of day. That's when I started hearing something strange. It was subtle at first, just the sound of something moving ahead of me. I stopped and listened. The forest was quiet, except for the wind. Then I heard it again, a steady thump, like footsteps, but they weren't coming toward me. They were moving away ahead on the trail. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe even a bear, but I didn't see any tracks. I kept going. About an hour later, the trail vanished completely. I stood in a dense patch of woods, looking around, but there was no path anymore. My GPS still said I was close, but something felt off. The device froze up for a second, then blinked off. I restarted it, but it took longer than usual to find a signal. While I waited, I checked my watch. It was nearly 5 p.m. I needed to make camp soon. I found a small clearing, barely big enough for my tent. It was uneven, and the ground was soft, but I didn't have much choice. I set up quickly and boiled some water. I ate in silence again, but something felt wrong. I kept looking into the trees, feeling like something was watching me. Every little sound made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to the sound of branches snapping nearby. I'd sit up in the dark, my hand on my knife, heart pounding, but nothing happened. Around 3 a.m., I heard a loud thump, like something heavy hitting the ground. Then silence. I didn't sleep again after that. In the morning, I packed up fast and decided to head back. I still had over a day's hike ahead of me, but I wanted to be out of the woods as soon as possible. The problem was, I couldn't find the trail anymore. My GPS kept glitching, showing me in different places. I started heading in the direction I thought was correct, using the sun to guide me. But the forest was dense and full of deadfalls and thorny bushes. My clothes were torn, and I had bruises all over. By late afternoon, I realized I was completely off track. I found myself in a deep hollow, surrounded by steep hills. I hadn't seen this place on the map. There were no signs of other hikers, no footprints, no trash, no markers. The trees here were taller and darker. I felt completely cut off. I decided to climb up the hill to get a better view, thinking I could maybe see the ridge or find a landmark. It took nearly an hour. When I got to the top, I saw nothing familiar, just more forest, hills stretching in all directions. I couldn't even see the ravine I'd crossed the day before. I was lost. I tried sending a signal with the beacon. The light blinked red. No connection. I climbed higher. Same result. I cursed under my breath, trying to stay calm. I had water and food for maybe another day and a half if I rationed it. But that was it. I made camp on the hilltop. It was the flattest spot I could find. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like something large moving through the trees. Not walking, but crashing. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. It moved in a wide arc around my camp. I stayed in the tent, knife in hand, trying not to breathe too loud. In the morning, I found broken branches and deep impressions in the soil. Something had been there. I didn't know what. I didn't care. I started moving again, heading west toward where I thought the river trail should be. I walked all day. I fell twice, scraped my leg, and lost my water bottle down a slope. I was exhausted, barely holding it together. Then, just before sunset, I heard rushing water. I ran toward the sound and found a stream. I knelt and drank. I've always loved hiking alone. It's not that I don't enjoy company, but when I hike solo, everything feels quieter, more focused. The sounds of the forest come alive. I can move at my own pace, stop when I want, and let my thoughts drift. It's peaceful, usually, but after what happened last fall, I've started rethinking solo trips altogether. This happened in October 2023. I was 32 at the time and had been hiking for years. I'd done all kinds of terrain, coastal hikes, desert hikes, high-altitude trails, but I had recently moved to northern Washington, and I wanted to explore more of the Cascade Range before the snow made everything inaccessible. I'd taken a Friday off work, packed my gear the night before, and headed out early in the morning toward a lesser-known trail called Ridgeback Traverse. It wasn't on most tourist maps, but a friend had mentioned it in passing once. I looked it up on a few forums and found some trip reports. People said it was beautiful but steep in some areas, with long ridgelines and narrow passes. It wasn't officially maintained anymore, but parts of it were still used by seasoned hikers. That sounded perfect to me. Challenging but rewarding, and most importantly, quiet. The trailhead was about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. I left just after sunrise, drank some gas station coffee on the way, and made it to the parking area by mid-morning. It was just a dirt turnout off an old Forest Service road. There were no other cars around. That should have been a red flag, but I brushed it off. This trail wasn't popular anymore. That's why I'd chosen it. I grabbed my pack, locked the car, and started in. The first part of the trail was typical Pacific Northwest forest. Thick fir trees, damp ground, scattered ferns. The air was cool and clean. Everything smelled like wet pine. Felt good to be out there. I made great time the first couple of hours. The elevation gain wasn't bad. Just a steady incline with a few steep switchbacks here and there. I passed some downed trees and sections where the trail had started to wash out, but nothing too bad. I had a paper map and a downloaded GPS track, and I checked both every now and then. By early afternoon, I reached the start of the ridgeline. The trees began to thin, and I could see further out across the valley. Mountains stretched out in every direction. The sun had come out fully, lighting everything up with that golden autumn glow. I stopped and ate a sandwich, drank some water, and looked over the edge of the ridge. It was a long drop, hundreds of feet at least. The trail here narrowed a bit, just like the forums had said, but it was manageable. I kept going. The next hour was slow. The trail hugged the edge of the ridge more closely than I liked. One side was a sheer drop, and the other side was thick brush and sharp rock walls. There were a few times I had to stop and breathe because the path felt too narrow. In some places, it was barely 2 feet wide. I moved carefully, testing each step. The wind started picking up too, making me a little more anxious. Gusts came up from the valley and rushed across the ridge like invisible waves. I crouched low when I needed to, just to feel safer. Eventually, the path started widening again and sloped down toward a large rocky saddle between 2 peaks. That's where I planned to set up camp. I found a flat spot marked on the map, and some trip reports mentioned it as a good resting place. I reached it just before 4 p.m., dropped my pack, and walked around a bit to stretch my legs. The saddle was wide and open. There was some scrub grass and small boulders, but mostly it was flat rock. The views were incredible, nothing but wilderness as far as the eye could see. I set up my small tent near a rock wall for a bit of wind cover, boiled water for dinner, and checked my GPS again. I was right on track. Everything was going to plan. As the sun started dropping, the wind picked up more. It wasn't dangerous yet, but I zipped up my jacket and added a layer. I ate my meal slowly, looking out at the horizon. The colors were starting to change, pinks, oranges, and purples washing over the sky. It would be dark soon. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind got worse. It wasn't just blowing steadily. It came in strong bursts, like punches against the side of my tent. The walls flapped loudly, and the whole tent shook with each gust. I'd staked it down properly, but even so, I was worried it might rip. Around midnight, one of the poles actually bent from the force. I got up, put on my headlamp, and reinforced everything with some rocks and extra cord. After that, I lay inside fully dressed, just listening to the wind scream around me. I probably got a couple of hours of broken sleep at best. When morning finally came, I felt groggy and sore. The wind had died down a bit, but it was still cold and cloudy. I packed up quickly, ate a protein bar, and got moving. The trail was supposed to loop around the backside of the ridge and connect to another trail that would take me down the mountain and back to the road where I'd parked. That was the plan anyway. I followed the GPS track along the ridge for a while. The trail was faint now, just a hint of a path in the grass and rock. I moved slowly, watching my step. The terrain got more unstable the further I went. Loose rocks, crumbly dirt. The clouds started thickening overhead, and I could tell rain was coming. That's when I made the mistake that changed everything. There was a fork in the path, sort of. One side looked more obvious, more used, while the other sloped sharply downward into a narrow gully. According to my GPS, I needed to go left, staying on the ridge a bit longer. But the screen glitched for a second and redrew the track slightly to the right. I second-guessed myself. Maybe this was the descent already. I turned right. First, it felt fine. The gully was steep, but the footing was decent. There were patches of loose gravel, but I moved slow and kept my center of gravity low. But after about 30 minutes of descending, I noticed the trail disappearing. There were no signs of footprints, no flattened grass, no markers of any kind. I checked my GPS again, and this time the track was gone completely. No signal. The panic didn't come right away, but I could feel it building. I turned around and tried to go back up the way I came, but climbing loose gravel is a lot harder than going down it. Every step slid back. After 15 minutes, I'd barely gained any ground. I sat down on a rock and tried to think. I wasn't hurt. I had food and water, and I still had several hours of daylight. I wasn't lost deep in the woods. I was somewhere off a known trail, but I was in a steep, rocky chute with no clear way up or down. The sides were too steep to climb out, and the bottom disappeared into thicker forest. I made a decision. I'd keep descending and hope it leveled out or connected to another trail or at least a clearing. It felt like a better option than trying to claw my way back up. The descent got worse. The gully narrowed and twisted. The rocks got looser and small slides happened under my feet. Once, I slipped and landed hard on my side, bruising my hip. Another time, I grabbed a branch for support, and it snapped, sending me tumbling a few feet down. I was collecting cuts and scrapes, dirt in my mouth, sweat stinging my eyes. My pack was starting to feel heavier too. After a couple more hours, the gully spat me out into a dense patch of forest. It was darker here, and everything felt damp and heavy. My GPS was still dead. I took out my map, but without a clear trail, it was almost useless. I couldn't tell exactly where I'd come out. I decided to head downhill. Water always flows down, and people often build roads or trails near water. Maybe I'd find a creek or river and follow it. That was the logic, at least. I walked for what felt like hours. The forest was thick. Ferns, fallen logs, uneven ground. I couldn't walk in a straight line. I tripped often. My ankle twisted more than once. I drank more water. I ate trail mix. My phone was on airplane mode, trying to preserve battery. But even when I turned it on briefly, there was no signal. That night, I didn't set up a tent. I just lay in my sleeping bag under a tarp. The ground was cold and wet. I kept waking up, heart pounding at every small sound. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, wind in the trees. I was exhausted, but my body wouldn't rest. The next morning, I realized I was out of clean water. I had a filter bottle, so I started looking for any sign of a stream. Eventually, I found a small trickle running over some rocks. I filtered a couple of bottles and filled up. The cold water helped me feel human again, at least for a while. I kept hiking downhill. Sometime in the afternoon, I found a set of old logging tracks. They were overgrown, but definitely man-made. Hope surged through me. I followed them, my legs screaming with every step, but I didn't stop. A couple hours later, I saw a sign nailed to a tree. It was faded and cracked, but I could still read it. Service Road 81 to 3 miles. I almost cried. I kept walking. The trail got clearer. Then I heard something, an engine. Distant at first, then I was never the type to back down from a challenge. I've done dozens of solo hikes before, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, but this time I was exploring a new area down in the southern part of Utah. The kind of place where the sandstone glows red in the sunlight, and the air is so dry it feels like your skin's peeling away after just a few hours. It was July, and yes, I know that's not the smartest time to be hiking in the desert, but I planned ahead. Or at least I thought I had. I had flown into Salt Lake City and rented a car. From there, I drove south for a few hours toward a national monument area that wasn't as popular as Zion or Arches. That's what I liked about it. Fewer people, fewer crowds, more silence. I didn't want the Instagram version of nature. I wanted to feel alone. I just didn't realize how alone I'd end up feeling. I picked a loop trail that ran about 18 miles long, with a smaller side trail that led up to a high ridge where people said you could see for miles, cliffs, canyons, and emptiness stretching out forever. That part of the trail had a warning sign near the start that said it was temporarily closed due to landslides and loose footing. But the sign looked like it had been there a while. Faded, a little cracked, with sand and dirt piling at the base. I figured it was just one of those things they forget to take down after the danger has passed. I wish I hadn't thought that way. I started early in the morning before sunrise. The trail began at a dirt pull-off just a few miles off a paved highway. The car was locked, parked in the corner. A small cooler and backup water left inside for when I returned. I had my pack on, full of supplies, enough water for the day, some protein bars, 2 sandwiches, extra clothes, a headlamp, and a printed map in a Ziploc. My phone had service, barely, but I knew I couldn't rely on it once I got deeper into the backcountry. The air was already warm, even before the sun came up. I remember how the wind felt dry against my neck, and how the sand shifted under my boots with each step. The main trail was easy to follow for the first few miles, well-marked, wide enough for a truck in some places, with tracks from ATVs and old hiking boots. Around mile 6, I reached the point where the side trail branched off, the one with the closure sign. I stopped, drank some water, checked the map again. According to the paper, this side trail would loop back around and rejoin the main one several miles ahead, saving about 4 miles of hiking and taking me up to a ridge where I could stop for lunch with a view. I stared at the sign again. It just said, "Trail closed due to rockslide. Travel not advised." No gate, no tape, nothing actually stopping you from going forward. I stood there for a while. Something about the silence felt weird. There were no birds, no wind, just me and that dry, still air. I stepped around the sign and started walking. At first, the trail was fine. A little narrower, a little more overgrown, but nothing dangerous. I followed it as it curved up and around a bend, then started climbing through rougher terrain. The ground was looser here, chunks of sandstone and broken shale, but it still looked walkable. About 30 minutes later, the trail really started climbing. I had to use my hands to steady myself. There were no trail markers anymore, but the path seemed clear enough. I kept thinking I'd get to the top of the ridge soon. I could already see the sky opening up above the rocks. I figured I was close. Then I reached a part of the trail that had clearly washed out. A narrow strip of dirt just vanished, crumbled away into a deep ravine on one side, with a wall of rock on the other. It was maybe a 5-foot stretch, but the ground on both sides looked soft and unstable. I crouched down, tested the edge with my hand. It crumbled away with the lightest pressure. My stomach tightened. I should have turned back. Right there. That was the moment. Instead, I dropped my pack, tossed it across to the other side, then slowly lowered myself to the ground and scooted across the washed-out section on my belly, trying not to look down into the ravine. My palms were sweating even though it was dry as hell. Each movement sent small pebbles skittering over the edge. When I made it to the other side, I sat back against the rocks and tried to calm my breathing. I could feel my heart beating in my neck. I told myself it would all be worth it. Just a bit more and I'd be at the top. The rest of the climb was worse. The trail got steeper, and it started breaking apart under my boots. Twice I slipped and cut my hand catching myself. One time I almost lost my balance completely, and I had to dig my fingers into the dirt to stay upright. By the time I got to the top, my shirt was soaked with sweat and stuck to my back, and my arms were shaking from the climb. But the view really was something. I could see the whole valley below. Miles of red rock and scrubby green shrubs, dry riverbeds cutting through the canyons. It was quiet, too quiet. I sat down, pulled out a sandwich, and ate it slowly, taking small sips of water. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like I didn't belong there. I looked at my watch. Still early, just past noon. I figured I had plenty of time to finish the loop and make it back before dark. I packed up and started walking again, following what looked like a trail along the ridgeline. That's when everything started going wrong. The path vanished. Literally. 1 minute there were faint boot prints and packed dirt, and the next there was just open rock. No markings, no signs, no cairns. I walked in a wide circle, thinking I just missed a turn, but it wasn't there. I couldn't tell where I had come from anymore. The sun was directly overhead, so I couldn't use shadows to help. Everything looked the same in every direction, just rock and scrub brush and sand. I told myself not to panic. I pulled out the map again, tried to match the rock formations to the topography. Nothing made sense. My GPS on the phone showed a vague blue dot floating in the middle of nothing. I had a compass, but no clear direction to head in. I figured the best thing to do was to head downhill. I knew the loop trail should be down in the valley below. If I could just get down off the ridge, I'd find it again. So I started down. That was a mistake. The terrain on the way down was brutal. Loose gravel, steep drop-offs, cactus hidden under the brush. I slipped several times and scraped the skin off my palm. At one point, I tripped over a rock and slammed my shoulder into the ground so hard it knocked the wind out of me. My water bottle rolled out of my pack and disappeared down the slope. I still had a backup, but it was getting low. I kept moving, slower now. Every step felt more dangerous than the last. The sun was brutal. No shade anywhere. My skin was burning. My lips cracked. My socks were soaked with sweat, and I could feel blisters forming under my heels. The worst part was how quiet everything was. No sounds, no planes, no wind, just the crunch of my boots and my own heavy breathing. Then I stepped wrong. My left foot landed on a patch of gravel, and it just slid out from under me. I fell hard, twisting as I went down. I heard something crack, somewhere in my ankle, and a hot wave of pain shot up my leg. I screamed. Not a word, just a raw noise. I lay there for a long time, curled up, clutching my leg. When I tried to stand, I almost blacked out. I couldn't put any weight on it. My ankle was swelling fast, already turning purple. I tore a sleeve off my shirt and tied it around my foot for compression, then used a stick to try and hobble down. Every few steps I had to stop and grit my teeth. Hours passed like that. I moved maybe a quarter mile in all that time. The sun started dropping lower in the sky. The light turned orange. Shadows grew long. My water was almost gone. I could feel the panic rising now, pressing against my ribs like a weight. I found a small overhang under a boulder and decided to stop there for the night. I had no choice. I ate the last of my food, just a granola bar, and tried to save the last few sips of water for morning. I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket from my pack and lay there on the dirt, shaking. Every sound made me jump. Coyotes howled in the distance. I heard rocks falling somewhere above me. I didn't sleep. By morning, my throat was dry as sand. My ankle was worse, so swollen I couldn't get my boot back on. I knew I couldn't walk far, but I had to try, so I left the boot behind and used my stick as a crutch, hopping on one leg down into the valley. That day was the worst of my life. No food, barely any water. Every movement sent pain through my whole body. I tripped more than once and almost couldn't get back up. I was starting to feel lightheaded. My thoughts weren't making sense anymore. I started seeing things like people standing on the rocks or the shimmer of a lake that wasn't there. Late in the afternoon, I found the trail. Couldn't believe it. A wide, clear dirt trail with footprints and tire tracks. I dropped to my knees and just sat there, crying. I followed it slowly, dragging my leg, pushing myself with the stick. I didn't know which direction would take me back to my car, but at that point I didn't care. I just followed it. 2 hours later, I saw a sign. It was a trail marker, faded but legible. The name matched the trailhead where I had started 2 days earlier. I was only 4 miles away. It started as a solo trip to clear my head. Life had been a mess for a while. I was tired of work, tired of the city, tired of being around people. I just needed a break. I picked a trail I had read about in a forum. It wasn't popular, which made it perfect. Less foot traffic meant more quiet, more space to breathe. It was a long trail that looped around a forest in northern Washington. I don't want to say exactly where because I'm not sure if someone else might try to go there. Looking back now, I wish I had just picked a busy trail. Something safe. Something where I could hear other hikers in the distance or run into a ranger if I needed to. I packed my gear carefully. I brought a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a filter, a satellite phone, extra socks, a knife, a first aid kit. I planned for 3 nights out there. I drove early in the morning and parked at a small pull-off spot near the trailhead. There was no one else around. The first couple hours of hiking felt good. The trees were tall and thick. The path was narrow but clear, and the forest floor was soft with fallen pine needles. By the time I reached the place I planned to set up camp for the first night, I had hiked about 8 miles. I pitched my tent near a small stream, ate some food, and stretched out in my sleeping bag. I felt peaceful. That night I heard only normal sounds. Insects, wind through the branches, the soft splash of water nearby. The next morning, I got up early and continued the hike. The terrain got steeper, the forest denser. There were sections of the trail that felt barely maintained, like no one had been through them in years. I liked it at first, felt wild, real. But as the hours passed and I didn't see a single sign of another person, I started to feel a little uneasy. Not scared, just alert. I saw a few deer in the distance, squirrels, birds, but not much else. Around late afternoon, I came across something strange. A backpack. It was old and moldy, and it was half buried in leaves. I stopped and looked at it for a while. There was no sign of who it belonged to. No ID. No gear scattered around. Just the backpack, like someone had dropped it and left. I left it alone and kept moving. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. Why would someone just leave it there? Maybe they got hurt. Maybe they made it out and just never came back for it. But it looked like it had been there for years. I pushed on and made camp a little off the trail. I didn't sleep as well that night. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something. Not voices or anything like that, just snapping twigs, soft thumps. Once, I sat up and listened for almost half an hour, but I didn't hear it again. I told myself it was animals. It had to be. The third day was the hardest. The trail climbed higher into rocky hills. The forest thinned out, and the wind picked up. I had to stop often to drink and rest. I wasn't far from finishing the loop, maybe another 10 miles or so, and I planned to camp one more night before heading back to the car. That's when I noticed the cuts. Small, shallow ones on my arm. I didn't remember getting scratched. They weren't bleeding much, but they weren't there the night before. I looked around, thinking maybe I brushed up against a thorn bush without noticing, but I hadn't seen any. My shirt sleeve wasn't torn. That night, I set up my tent in a narrow clearing between two hills. It was a tight space, surrounded by boulders and thick shrubs. I figured the rocks would block the wind. As it got dark, I started to feel a pressure in my chest, a sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, just being alone too long. But then I heard it, a slow, steady scraping sound, like something being dragged across rock. I sat in my tent, completely still. The sound came again. I turned off my headlamp and waited. The noise stopped. I unzipped the tent a few inches and looked out. Nothing, just darkness. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I packed as fast as I could and started hiking. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just wanted to get out. The trail was rough. The map said I should hit a junction where the loop started closing within a couple miles, but I never found it. I kept walking. I should have been making a descent back toward the lower forest, but the trail kept going up. At one point, I tripped and fell hard. I scraped my knee and tore my pants. I sat there for a while, catching my breath, and noticed something that made my stomach drop. A broken tree with a mark carved into it. I had seen that same tree the day before. I was going in circles. I took out the satellite phone, but the screen was dead. It had been charged. I tested it before leaving. I tried turning it on several times, but nothing happened. I sat on a rock and tried not to panic. I forced myself to eat something, then took a deep breath and tried to retrace my steps. For the next few hours, I followed the trail back the way I came. I passed the clearing where I'd camped the second night. It was a relief to see something familiar. I kept going. The sun was getting low when I saw it. Another tent. It wasn't mine. It was old and sun-faded. The rainfly was torn, flapping in the breeze. I approached carefully. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I looked inside. There was nothing there. Just some debris, old leaves, dirt. No gear, no sleeping bag. Just an empty tent. But near it, on the ground, I found a pair of hiking boots. They were cracked and weather-worn, and they were small, like way smaller than mine. Too small for an adult. My skin crawled. I didn't know what I was looking at. Why would someone leave a tent and boots out here, and why were they so small? I kept going. At that point, I was walking fast, almost running. I didn't stop again until the sky started turning dark. I had no choice but to camp again. I didn't bother with the tent. I wrapped myself in the sleeping bag under a dense tree and waited for morning. That night was the worst. There were sounds all around me, crunching, snapping, breathing. I kept my knife close and stayed wide awake, eyes darting around in the dark. I never saw anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. My heart didn't stop pounding all night. When morning came, I started hiking again. I was filthy, hungry, and completely drained. I followed the path downhill, hoping I was going the right way. Around noon, I finally saw something that almost made me cry. A trail marker. It was faded, half fallen over, but it was the first sign I had seen that told me I was on the main path. I pushed forward. It took another 6 hours, but by late evening I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, dusty but untouched. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a long time. I didn't turn the key. I just stared at the steering wheel, hands shaking. I drove home that night. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. When I finally got home, I took a long shower, then sat on my bed, trying to make sense of what happened. I didn't tell anyone, not for a while. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. But I know what I felt out there. I know I wasn't alone. I know something was wrong with that trail, and I know I'll never go back. After a few weeks, I did some searching online. I didn't find much, just one post buried deep in a forum from someone who said they hiked that same trail years ago and got lost. They said they saw signs of others but never saw another person. They said they felt watched. They never finished their story. I deleted my account after reading that. I'm still not the same. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't sleep well in tents. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear that scraping sound again. I know it was real. Whatever was out there, whatever happened, it wasn't just in my head. And I never did figure out where those cuts on my arm came from.